Okay, so the lymphatic system, right? Chapter 20. All right. So what is the function of the lymphatic system, right? Takes fluids that leak out from the blood vessels, and that's why we're talking about this right after the blood vessels, because we're seeing the fluid leaking from the blood vessels back into the bloodstream through this system. So what do we mean by fluid? What is the name for the fluid part of blood? What is the name for the fluid part of blood? What do we call that fluid of blood? Starts with a P. Anybody? Plasma. In fact, what occurs in the capillary bed, because we're in the capillaries, that's where we're at this time, is that when we give off oxygen and carbon dioxide, it gets picked up, and the nutrients and the waste, all that exchange happens, right? That we're leaking out plasma from blood. And that's what makes the interstitial fluid. Remember what interstitial fluid is, right? That's what makes the interstitial fluid there. Bathed cells. And at this time, when we're sending this off, we actually have a system, the lymphatic system, to pick all the fluid back up. Right? Pick it all up. So the system includes the following parts. The lymphatic vessels, call these lymphatics. The lymph, which is the fluid, we call the fluid now that's in the lymph system, lymph. And the lymph nodes, which are little aggregations of kind of where cells are along the route of the blood, of the lymphatic vessels. Excuse me. Okay? We'll see all three of them in play here in just a second. The lymphoid organs and tissues are parts of the lymphatic system that give us the foundation of the immune system. This is kind of where the immune system is housed, where it matures, okay, which is part of the lymphatic system. So the organs and tissues consist of the spleen, the thymus, the tonsils, the lymph nodes. We'll see other lymphatic tissues as well. Again, that's why I wanted you to look at the lymphatic lab exercise yesterday, because that way at least you're warmed up to when we talked about this right now. So again, it actually returns the fluid, but the fluid is actually interstitial fluid. And where do we get that fluid from? We get it from plasma, from blood. And again, we do it through the lymphatic vessels, right? There are vessels, drainage vessels, that almost look exactly like veins. Kind of very similar. Look like veins. So on the average, about 3 liters of interstitial fluid gets circulated or put back into the lymphatic system and back into blood eventually. About 3 liters a day. Okay? So once the fluid enters the lymphatics or the vessels, it's called lymph. Lymph. Okay? The name changes, but the fluid is still the same. Does that make sense to you? Right? Just the name changes because it's in a different location. The lymphatic vessels are a one-way system, which means it doesn't go back into the interstitial fluid and back and forth. It only goes one way. That lymph through the lymphatic vessels is going towards the heart. It doesn't drop off into the heart. It goes really close to the heart. I'm going to show you just a little bit. If you've seen in the book, this is where you'll see where it goes. Now those vessels are kind of set up the same way that other blood vessels like the veins are set up, in the fact that they have lymphatic capillaries, like the network of like blood capillaries, but these are lymphatic capillaries, kind of the same thing, found in the same area. And then they become larger vessels on their way up towards or nearby the heart. The lymphatic capillaries are blind-ended capillaries, so they look like they're closed off, but they have a little opening at the end. They're located between the tissue cells and the blood capillaries. We have them everywhere except for in bone tissue, in the teeth, in bone marrow. It's where we don't have them. Everywhere else we do. So lymphatic capillaries are actually more permeable than blood capillaries. They can take up larger molecules where that capillaries cannot. Bigger molecular structures. And to give you some examples there, large proteins can be taken up in the lymphatic system. Parts of cells that have been broken down or damaged. Pathogens like viruses and bacteria can be taken up through the lymphatic system. And unfortunately, cancer too, cells that are cancerous, that have permanently changed, right? Mutated their genetics. And that's why we talk about lymphatic system in cancer, because when cancer then comes into this state where it divides uncontrollably, and then detaches from the area in the body where it's forming, it can take a trip, and the highway system it uses is the lymphatic system. It can go through the lymphatic system and then lodge itself in different parts of the body, and this is how cancer spreads or metastasizes. This is why we talk about this. Okay? Even so that there's stages for this process. When we see cancer developing from one place to another place in the body, the stages indicate that that's happened. And that starts at stage 3. You know about cancer, there's 4 stages, right? Stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and stage 4. The higher the number, the worse it gets, right? And right at stage 2 to 3, this is where the cancer travels in the lymphatic system, and you find it in other places. Does that make sense? That's what you see. So here is the lymphatic system. And all we're seeing is the the systemic circulation there. And now we put in the lymphatic system. And we're looking at, more particularly in part B, where the lymphatic capillaries are embedding next to or in between the blood capillaries and the cells. And we're picking up fluid there. That's where we're seeing them. And of course, where you find capillaries, blood capillaries are where you're going to find lymphatic capillaries. All right, so in the capillary in particular, you have endothelial cells too, but the endothelial cells overlap each other. And we call this area here where they overlap a mini valve. And we'll see a mini valve here in the next figure. Collagen filaments, collagen fibers anchor the filament to the matrix, and so when the volume increases in the extracellular fluid, it causes then the valve to open, and that's how the fluid goes in. This is how it gets monitored or regulated because of its structure. Lacteals are specialized lymph capillaries that you find in the intestinal mucosa, which means these are specialized to be found inside lining the intestinal wall, because they do a special process. And the special process here in the intestines is actually to absorb a large molecule that we call fat. And it's specialized to bring in fat through the intestinal wall, or fat in your diet through this special type of lymphatic capillary system we call lacteals. We'll see lacteals when we visit the digestive system, which we are going to do this semester too. Here are the mini valves, by the way, right? The little circle represents the mini valve. You see the two endothelial cells, kind of one's overlapping the other one, right? And that little space in between opens up and allows the fluid to go through into the lymphatic capillary. The little kind of squiggly lines, those are the collagen filaments that are attached to the matrix. Now, we always show it in green because green is a different color than blue or red, but in particular, your lymphatic capillaries or vessels are not green in your body. If you were to open, person up, the color would be the same as the veins and the arteries, okay? Just in A&P or in a textbook like this, we color it green to represent as lymphatic system versus cardiovascular system. Those capillaries drain into larger and larger vessels. We call those vessels collecting vessels. And just like the veins, where they increase in size as we get towards the heart, these are also increasing in size as we go through the heart. Larger lymphatic vessels, called lymphatic trunks, is where we actually start to collect all these vessels. These vessels start to migrate and become bigger vessels, and one of the bigger vessels become trunks. And trunks are named for the area or the region they're located in. So there's several trunks there. Most of which you can figure out if you already know your regional terms, like lumbar, right? Kind of over by your hips, right, area, pelvis. Bronchomediastinal, that's kind of where the bronchus, which is kind of the respiratory area, chest area. Subclavian stands for subclavian, artery or vein. That's where that's at. The jugular trunk, that's the neck. Intestinal trunk, that's where the intestine or stuff. So all those big trunks basically feed into two main big trunks, and we call those two trunks ducts. So there's two main ones of the body, right? The right lymphatic duct collects all the vessels, the fluid from all the vessels on the right upper arm and the right side of the head and the thorax. That area alone. And the thoracic duct drains all the rest of the body. There's a reason behind that, and it's really because of the position of the heart. It's more left. Because it's more left, it collects more on the left side than anything. And this is what you see, right? You see the lymphatic vessels going kind of in the same route as a vein would. And then they dump in two places. All right, the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct. And if you notice, you follow the blue line, it points to right between the left jugular and the left subclavian vein. You see the green line goes in right in between on the right and left side. And that's where it's dumping the fluid or the lymph back into the bloodstream. And that fluid actually mixes up with blood, and it feeds right into the superior vena cava. See where the superior vena cava is? We don't see the heart. And the reason why we don't see the heart is we pulled it away so we can see the lymphatic vessels behind it. But we know that that's the superior vena cava. And between the jugular vein and the subclavian vein, right in between is where the thoracic and the right lymphatic duct drain their fluid. Those are your two main ducts. All the fluid collects and dumps. And now what we've done with this picture is actually just put all the lymphatic vessels normally where they're found, the larger vessels where they're found, and then puts where the vein, where they dump into the ducts there, and see where they're positioned kind of close to the aorta, right? They're kind of in the same generalized area. They travel up in the same area as the artery and veins. And you can see where they're at. Okay? Notice that there is areas where there's an aggregation of these little nodules or nodes, right? Where you can see them named for you. There's a cervical node, axillary node, inguinal node, right? Those are called regional lymph nodes. And I want you to tell me or think through it and answer this question. Why is there an aggregation or a collection, a dense collection of these nodes in these main areas, these three areas on your right side, but on the left side of the person? Why is there a cervical nodes, axillary nodes, and inguinal nodes?
I guess like where the most motion is at, where the joints, neck,
That's a good guess. I mean, that's a good guess, but not exactly. But good guess.
Is it something with like being the opposite side of where the heart is?
No, because you see cervical nodes on the left side, but there's also some on the right. It's just not pointing out to you. So it's bilateral. You see nodes on both ends. The cervical nodes are basically all the neck right here in the face, right? There are a bunch of nodes there. There's a bunch of nodes on kind of right by the armpit, this area here. And there's a bunch of nodes right by the inguinal or the groin area. Maybe that helps you out.
the bones.
Not necessarily the bones, right? Good guess too. But you're thinking outside the box. Okay, good. You're all thinking outside the box.
Where the main arteries are, I guess.
No, I mean, yeah, it's there, but there's arteries everywhere else. I mean, there's major arteries everywhere else. No?
Is it like the flow of digestion, like ingestion and then just like going down to the bottom?
That's a good guess, yeah. Not exactly, but it's kind of close to, we're getting warmer. We're getting warmer. This has to do with barriers of entry or exit, or portals of entry or exit. Now we're talking a little bit about microbiology, but we're really talking about places where there's a good chance of getting bad things going into your body, right? So like the mouth is a perfect area to actually have outside things go in, and your nose and your ears. And also in the area where the inguinal area is, like the genital tract, the urinary tract, and the digestive system, the anus. Do you see what I'm saying now? Is that these are entry points to potential things that can get into your body and cause harm. Now the lymphatic system, one of it, the main process is to drain the fluid, but what else do we need to house inside the lymphatic system that we just talked about? What else is also really important? The immune system. And what does the immune system do for our body? We haven't talked about what the immune system does, but what does it do? What do you think it does? Fights off, defends our body from foreign invaders, right? Bacteria, viruses, or other things. Well, where do you think a bacteria would have the best capability, best possible way of getting past our skin level where we have a good barrier? Where are the places? Your mouth, your nose, your ears, your eyes, your reproductive tract, your urinary system, and your digestive system. Through food, through water, through air, through contact. Do you see what I'm saying now? You see what I'm talking about? Now you'll notice that it says the axillary, which is the armpit. And you might think to yourself, well, what about the armpit? Well, there are skin pores there, right? That is a perfect opportunity because this area right here is a perfect place because you have a lot of nutrients, a lot of moisture, right? And a lot of heat. It's a perfect breeding area for stuff to go in through here. But what about the middle part? I wanted to show you right here. What about this? Right there and right there. Notice that it's kind of forming an area where the what is found? Nipple and the breast tissue. So if it's a male, it's not a problem, but if it's a female, breastfeeding is there, well, on occasion, right? That's an area to bring stuff in and out. Does that make sense to you? That's why it's set up to where there's an aggregation or dense collection of these nodes in those areas. Because the lymphatic system is also a place where we're storing or harboring the immune system cells. And if for some reason a bacteria, let's say, or virus gets past our skin level and into our bloodstream and then into the interstitial fluid, trying to invade a cell, well, the lymphatic system's picking up the fluid and sending it on its way, and the nodes are areas of where a bunch of cells are located, where the immune system kind of sits there and monitors, like a checkpoint station. Does that make sense? Like the Border Patrol's checkpoint station. So it's going to monitor what's going past. And if that bacteria gets into that fluid, guess what it's going to do? It's going to stop it right there and then turn on the alarm system. You see what I'm saying there now? See how that's, okay. Because that's what we're getting into. Eventually we're going to get to the immune system after the exam, but that's kind of, we're leading ourselves up to that part.
That being said, as far as the memory, where they make the milk, of course, is going to try to prevent bacteria and stuff from going in there for production of milk. How does that lymphatic system, because it has to do with the immune system, what does that play in as far as the milk, and when the baby drinks the milk, it can get like the immunities from the mother?
So we call that passive immunity. And when we talk about passive immunity, that means the antibodies of the female, along with the other immune system proteins, get passed readily through the breast milk to the infant. So this is a way to load up some of the things that the infant can't make yet, but are used to protect the body from pathogens.
Okay, so it's just a buildup of antibodies, have nothing to do with the lymphatic system at all?
No, not really, because, well, it does have to do with the lymphatic system and the fluid that is found there that add to the breast milk. So when milk gets produced, we also see the fluid there, and that's where the immune system cells and those proteins get put into milk and then into the child. So that's called passive immunity. It's a way to protect your child, to give the child enough time to be protected so that when the child starts to grow and grow, their immune system gets stronger and stronger. Because everything's kind of like, it's new and ready to go, but it needs to be refined and matured, including the immune system. That's why an infant, the common knowledge is when you have a newborn child, you're not supposed to interact that child to the outside environment for at least, it's like 3 or 4 months.
Oh yeah, don't be kissing my child.
Yes, and that's why. Because all those little pathogens out there that we are immune to that don't affect us whatsoever are going to affect the child because they really don't have an immunity yet. It's just they're growing. What breast milk does is it protects them while they're kind of growing up, maturing their immune system. Yeah. Good. More of that in micro, so we'll talk all that in the fall for sure. Okay, lymphagitis is an inflammation of the lymphatic vessels. This is a clinical condition, right? Lymphatic vessels are painful red lines. You'll see this on the surface of the skin. So we see this, it's an inflammation, so there's a swelling occurring here, obviously. Okay, so the lymph fluid is a low pressure system, all right? And much like the veins, it does carry itself back to the ducts like the veins do. And so we just talked about veins and how milking occurs, right? Where the skeletal muscle is pushing against the vein to push it up. That also occurs. Breathing does help the fluid move, right? The lymphatic vessels do have valves too, just like the veins do. Little one-way valve system. the arteries, when they're pushing their blood through, their artery pushes against the lymphatic vessel and causes then fluid to move too. So we see all this happening. That's how we move lymphatic fluid through, if you will. Notice the bottom statement, right? Physical activity increases the flow of lymph. Right? So moving around, if you will, activity helps move that fluid around or through. That's good for circulation, but also lymph circulation. So why do you keep an injury immobile when they tell you, okay, let's say you break a bone, right? And you keep it immobile. Well, one, you're trying to heal bone. It's, we already know how that process works, collagen, and it's still soft and can't put weight on it. But number two, you're really trying to isolate the fluid there, the lymph. You're trying to keep it there so the immune system can help heal or fight infections much quicker. That's why immobilization is important. Okay, so what is lymphedema? It's a localized edema. Edema is a swelling, fluid swelling that you find in the body. That's what edema is. So sometimes this occurs in injuries. This can be, that type of situation that can block lymph flow to eventually into the bloodstream. Okay, so now we're in the cells and the tissues. So we'll talk about the cells that are composed of the lymphatic system or found in the lymphatic system, right? Okay, so there's two main ones, right? Number one, the immune system cells. Okay? Immune system cells are found in the lymphatic system. And number two, the supporting cells that support the tissue and its structure. Okay? Supporting cells and then the immune system cells. Okay, so we'll start off with the immune system cells, right? So these are actually the lymphocytes, right? The lymphocytes are types of what? Blood cells, right? That is a general term to describe the two types of lymphocytes. T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, or T cells and B cells. These are specialized types of immune system cells. T cells and B cells protect us from antigens. Antigens is a word that we use to describe anything in the body or on the body that the body perceives as foreign. That's the key word. Antigens. So, what's considered an antigen? Those little microorganisms like bacteria or viruses or toxins that sometimes bacteria secrete, or red blood cells and their receptors on the surface. We call those antigens, right? Remember that whole thing? Cancer cells can be read as antigens. Regular plain Jane chemicals can sometimes be read as an antigen, a foreign thing. And when we receive the foreign thing, then the B and T cells will act on it. They want to get rid of it. They want to isolate it, neutralize it, kill it, destroy it, in fact. The T cells are the managing cells of the immune system response. Okay? The B cells are the ones that actually will activate and then turn into what we call plasma cells. And then those plasma cells will, all they do, their responsibility is to make and then secrete antibodies. And antibodies act as a big old net or capturing type of chemical. Prevents the toxin from causing more damage, or the chemical from causing more damage, or the bacteria from invading more cells, or the virus from invading more cells. And it gives it enough time to actually cause the other immune system cells to migrate toward the area and destroy it completely, or break it down completely. That's what occurs. Okay? So you have mainly B and T cells, but you also have other immune cells, right? Here are the other two here. Macrophages. We know what macrophages do. They undergo phagocytosis, right? Sometimes they're the first type of cell that runs into an antigen. They'll start to phagocytize it. They'll eat it, break it down, or kill it. And then they'll basically present it to the T cell. Say, hey, look, this is what I found. And the T cell says, okay, well, let's activate. Let's turn on everybody, come to the area, and then continue to wipe everything clean. And then the dendritic cells. Dendritic cells kind of do the same thing, but they capture an antigen. They also deliver it to the lymph nodes. They also help activate the T cell. And then number two, you have the supporting cells. So those are the immune system cells. Now you have the supporting cells. Reticular cells' responsibility is to produce reticular fibers. Those fibers are called stroma, and you find them in the lymphatic organs. It's like a structural type of chemical that gives it structure for the immune system cells to kind of prop themselves up onto the reticular fibers, the stroma. So that's what we see here, right, by the way. That's what we see here. So what we're seeing is actually a lymph node, and we're looking at all the cells. So first identify, you see the macrophage, the immune system cell, the lymphocytes, immune system cell. And you can see how they're posting up or actually placed on the reticular fibers, which is kind of like scaffolding, looks like a mesh, right? That's the reticular fibers produced by the reticular cells. And you can see how the lymphocytes and the macrophages are kind of attached to the fibers. That's their way to kind of perch right there. And in between all the black area would be lymph flow. There would be fluid flowing through there. And if there's an antigen in the fluid, it's going to get hit or it's going to run into one of the, either a lymphocyte or macrophage or both, and this is where the interaction will occur, in fact. What's the function of the lymphoid tissue then? Like we just saw, right? Houses the lymphocytes, also gives a housing area for the lymphocytes to undergo proliferation, which means divide, make more of themselves. This is a key word to understand the function, right? That's how this whole thing works. Surveillance, vantage point. Does that make sense? They're sitting there watching, or not watching because they don't use eyes, but they're running into, or antigens can run into them. This is the filtering part. This is what I mean by filtering. Because as they run into it, they're going to destroy it, right? If it's a piece of a cell, like a part of a cell that's been broken up because there might be damage, or a cell is kind of, too old and we've already broken down naturally by the body. it'll run into a macrophage, and the macrophage will completely break it down even further. Or if it's a bacteria and it's alive, it's going to run into it and then attack, right? And the lymphoid tissue, of course, has got a bunch of reticular connective tissue, right? That's the reticular fibers we're talking about. It's loose connective tissue, by the way, if we talk about tissues. And the macrophages house themselves on the reticular fibers. Now, they can actually detach themselves from the reticular fiber and then migrate all the way through the lymph fluid into the bloodstream and back around. So they can do that too. It's like a checkpoint, and then also we can get in the car, Border Patrol, and then take off and go search. Then come back to the spot if you want to. That's kind of what they do. So you've got lymphoid tissue. Okay, you find this in every body organ where you have this diffuse lymphoid tissue. Where there's lymphoid cells and reticular fibers in a vessel. This is what you see there. And then there's places in that vessel where there's a highly packed area of lymphoid cells and reticular fibers, and we call that a lymph node or nodule, right? That highly collected area in a lymphatic vessel where it's tightly packed. It's a high concentration of lymphoid cells and immune system cells and the supporting cells and the reticular fibers. So we call these lymphoid organs, right? And they're broken down, or they're distinguished by two functional categories: the primary and the secondary. The primary only has two places, right, in the body: the red bone marrow and the thymus. The red bone marrow and the thymus is the two places where B and T lymphocytes or B and T cells mature. Okay? We know that, because we went through blood, we know that all white blood cells get made in the bone marrow, right? Red bone marrow, right? All white blood cells, including B and T cells. The B cells stay in the red bone marrow and mature there. The T cells go to the thymus and they mature there. Okay? The secondary lymphoid organ is where those mature lymphocytes first encounter an antigen and then become activated. So this happens through the course of a person's daily life, right? So it's not like it's at one point in their whole life that this happens. This happens all the time. So what this means is we're making B and T cells all the time, right? Immature ones. They mature for a while. So I always use a military or police force is kind of how I relate it, because it makes a lot of sense. Because if it's a police force, you hire a police officer, they go through what? Training, right? They go through school, basically. And that training is the red bone marrows, where we train them, make them, and then we send them out for training, right? Depending on what you are, you're going to go to the thymus to train some more and become mature, know your job, right? Educate yourself. And then we've got the rookie that comes out of the training, and then what? Day one, first day of the job, right? The newbie, right? And then the newbie's going to practice what they were taught, right? Basically, that's what's going on with secondary lymphoid organs. That's their position. They're in their station, right? Their area. And so they run into an antigen, and then that's their training. That's their actual on-the-job kind of. This is your first day patrol, stop, whatever they're doing, right? And this is what they do, right? The first area they're stationed, where they're located, can be the nodes. They can patrol there, or that's going to be their first job. There's the spleen, or this place we call MALT, and that stands for mucosa associated lymphoid tissue. MALT. Okay. Pretty much everywhere. That's all the lymphatic system. So this figure 25, shows you the primary versus secondary lymphoid organs. Right? There's your thymus and red bone marrow, and on the right side there is your lymph nodes, your spleen, and the other ones there are tonsils that I skipped over, Peyer's patches that I skipped over, and appendix are all considered MALT, mucosa associated lymphoid tissue. And your tonsils, in fact, are part of the lymphatic system that hold your immune system. Now we talked about those nodes that are located by your neck and your face, right? Those cervical nodes. But then we have really special ones we call tonsils. And tonsils are really cool because they can actually trap things that you find in, let's say, things that you put in your mouth. Food, objects, water, whatever. Now the Peyer's patches are located, they're aggregated areas in the intestinal wall. Because again, if you're taking food or water, they might have things that might be bad for you, like pathogens. And the appendix is a specialized one there. So lymph nodes are your secondary lymphoid organ. Again, there are hundreds of them. They're scattered throughout the body. They're aggregated or collected in specialized areas, and they're actually found close to the skin in those areas, the inguinal, the axillary, and the cervical region. Those are your cervical nodes, your axillary nodes, and your inguinal nodes. But they're found everywhere, they're scattered. That figure, right? That's what we're seeing, just adding on to it, defining the rest of it, which we've already kind of done already. Right? Again, if you notice the cervical node, you'll notice that some of them are underneath the chin or underneath the jaw. In fact, there's one that you can feel, palpate kind of right here. If you push hard enough, you can probably feel that little node, depending on how much tissue you have there. And if you have an infection in the face, that one is the first one that usually will be swollen. So sometimes when you have something wrong with a child, or if you have a sore throat and you go to the doctor, that's what they usually do. Have you ever had this done before? They push right here underneath. What they're feeling for is swelled up or inflamed lymph nodes, which is indicative of an infection. Does that make sense? Closer toward your face, probably your mouth or your respiratory system.
Is that one the submandibular?
Submandibular, yeah. Nodes, yeah. And if you push, you can feel them really small. You got to push hard enough. But if they're swollen, you can really feel them. Sensitive to touch if they're swollen. Okay, so again, here are the functions, right? We're cleansing the lymph. We're filtering the lymph fluid. Because remember, that lymph fluid is actually just plasma. It's just in a different location. And we're going to put that fluid back into blood. So in fact, we're filtering the entire bloodstream and filtering the entire body. That's what we're really doing. It's going through this one little area. The macrophages, all those white blood cells are monitoring. They're removing things like microorganisms. Right? That's what they're doing. And we activate the rest of the immune system through there. Because once we hit something that's not supposed to be in the body, it's like turning on an alarm system. So if it hits one cell, the one cell is going to tell the rest of the immune system, hey, there's something that's not supposed to be there. And we mount a huge system-wide attack of the antigen or antigens. And that keeps us alive, by the way. I mean, if we didn't have that, we would slowly, or not slowly, we would easily die of a simple infection. Okay? Lymph nodes vary in size, but they're usually this, bean-shaped. They're about an inch or so. It's usually the size of a lymph node. It's got a fibrous connective tissue. We call that a capsule. That's what is on the outside. It's very dense and a little tough on the outside. And the fibers extend inward, and we have this kind of subdivision. We call this a trabeculae. We use that same word in bone tissue. Remember that trabeculae of the bone tissue? We use that same word to talk about these little kind of cavities inside the lymph node. When you look at the tissue, there's two areas, and hopefully you got to see a lymph node yesterday in the microscope, so you would see the cortex, the outside portion, and then the inner portion, the medulla. In the cortex, which is the outside covering of the rind, right? We have these little follicles or collections of cells that have the B cells there. B cells are located there, and they'll divide and divide. And the T cells are found a little bit deeper into the cortex. Those are the ones that circulate throughout the bloodstream and the lymph nodes and the lymph. And the dendritic cells are also found in the cortex, right? And the medulla have both B cells that are mature, T cells that are mature, and then your plasma cells that produce antibodies. Remember, B cells turn into plasma cells, and plasma cells produce and secrete antibodies. The sinuses are just little smaller areas or cavities where made by the reticular fibers, where you're going to have the macrophages kind of sitting there watching. That's your typical lymph node, right? What you see in the book and also in the lab book, right? So one of the things you'll have to memorize is those parts of the lymph node, right? In lab, right? And notice it's a one-way system. On the left side, the arrows go in, and on the right side, the arrows go out. That's the one-way system. Fluid in from the left, in, through all of that tissue there, and then fluid on the outside, on the right. Fluid in, fluid out. We call that afferent versus efferent. We use those two terms to describe, for example, the nervous system, right? Afferent, efferent. We're still using those same words, right? What goes in and what comes out. Afferent, efferent. And hopefully you saw something like this in the lymph node slide, right? You saw something like this, where you see the outside cortex, and then you see these little circles, but those are the follicles, kind of collecting areas where all the cells are kind of put together. And towards the middle, it kind of gets a little bit wider, right? And again, it just talks about the circulation in a lymph node, right? So I'm not going to go through that, but I'll let you read that on your own. We're looking at just seeing that there. Bulbils are inflamed lymph nodes. Not lymphedema, but lymph nodes that are inflamed. We call those bulbos, right? Bulbos, right? They're inflamed or swollen glands, for example. And we'll see that on occasion. That's usually a condition of an infection, right? And again, lymph nodes can be secondary. It can be an area where they can be a secondary site for cancer. And they can actually use those as a highway system for the traveling cancer. Okay, the spleen. It's found on the left side of the abdominal cavity. just below the stomach. It's the largest lymphoid organ. It actually has a major artery and vein, we call it the splenic artery and vein. And of course, the spleen is where you're going to have proliferation, which means dividing of the lymphocytes, where we surveil the lymph fluid in response. And the spleen is also, going back to blood, is where you actually break down old red blood cells and platelets. So the macrophages is also, their responsibility is also to break those down and remove them. Again, back to revisiting this because we're kind of referencing it back. Here's your spleen. We cut it. This would be the splenic artery vein, and it spreads out. So we see the spreading of the arteries becomes capillaries, and that tissue inside is responsible for doing those functioning things. And in fact, there's what we call a red pulp and a white pulp, and that's kind of what you see there. That's a cadaver. That's a deceased person. That's what you see to be the spleen there, kind of sitting on top and close to on the left side of below the stomach. That's why you see the left kidney there by the pancreas. Pancreas kind of brushes up against it. All right, it breaks down red blood cells. It also can store the iron. Remember, the iron gets stored in our body, one of the places in the liver, but also in the spleen and the kidneys, right? We hold iron there. Because we're going to use it later. So when we make more red blood cells, guess where we put that? We use that iron to put it on the red blood cell in the hemoglobin group. Kind of goes back to blood, right? Platelets are stored there. Monocytes are stored there. That's another type of white blood cell. And we think the spleen, because it's such a big size, by the way, in the fetus, we think that the fetus uses the spleen as the place where we produce red blood cells for the fetus. It's a weird thing to think about, but you have to go back to the fetus because the fetus hasn't created all of the, bone yet, tissue. Remember, it's all cartilage, becomes bone eventually, but most of the lifespan of the fetus doesn't have hard bone yet, so because they don't have that, they don't have red bone marrow. So they're not really producing red blood cells, but the spleen does that job. And once the fetus is born, it's a newborn and an infant, the bones kind of start taking over. And I mentioned there's a white pulp and a red pulp. The white pulp area is where the immune functions occur. This is where you find most of your lymphocytes, in that portion of the spleen. The red pulp, we call it the red pulp, is because that's where we break down red blood cells. Okay? What you see there, red pulp and white pulp. This is also the spleen. This is the white pulp area, and it's that circle there, and the red pulp is everything around it, basically. So the spleen can be damaged. It gets damaged pretty easily because this capsule is very thin, right? So it can break open, or blood vessels can break. It can be damaged really quickly. So we know where the spleen is. You can punch pretty easily. I mean, not easily, but you got to punch pretty hard to hit the spleen. But if you hit the spleen, locate the spleen, immobilize the person pretty easily. So you can remove the spleen if you wanted to. We usually do not nowadays. We usually remove the part that's damaged and the other part will stay around. You can repair itself, but we used to remove the spleen if it was damaged. But even at that, the liver and the bone marrow take over the responsibility of the spleen. So you don't need a spleen to continue to survive. So if you had to remove the spleen, the person would still function just fine. Okay, I'm going to stop there because we're running out of time, but that talks about mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. Talk about the tonsils and the Peyer's patches in the appendix. And I just want to show you really quick. I want you to go because it's part of the process, but this is the tonsil under the microscope. Hopefully you got to see that. But you'll notice these little white areas in between all the purple, the little white, kind of looks like little tunnels. Those are areas that are found on the tonsil that bacteria, for example, or viruses get caught or trapped in those little areas, and then those cells use their lymphocytes to attack and kill the bacteria. That's what tonsils are used for. So specialized areas these are called tonsillar crypts, by the way. Crypts, the little white areas, where if food has a bacteria or virus, it'll get trapped in there, and then we can attack it. The body attacks it, right? That's the function of the tonsils. Why are they located in that area? Because again, we're sending air through there, food, water, and those are places where you have the potential of getting an infection. A portal ventricle, called a portal ventricle. Okay?